Ukraine's security forces have started to clear barricades from the capital city centre and clear roads from anti-government protesters. Now, they've been out in the streets for more than 2 weeks now after the country's leadership postponed the signing on an economic integration deal with the EU. Well, joining us live a little later, I believe, from Strasbourg is Marusya Lyubcheva. She's a Bulgarian MEP and member of the Delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Cooperation Committee. She was close to the failed association deal between the two powers, and I now know that she is indeed joining us live here on RT International for this discussion. In Bern, we have historian Srdja Trifkovic. He's an international affairs expert. And Robert Oulds, he joins us from London. And here in the studio, we have Aleksey Yaroshevsky, who's just returned from Kiev, and RT news editor Ivor Crotty, who's been doing a lot of research on this developing story in Ukraine. Aleksey, let me just turn to you immediately. In the light of what's happening at the moment, it appears that the security forces are indeed now removing the protesters from the centre of Kiev. When you were there reporting in Kiev, what did you make of the way the authorities handled the situation?
You know, Bill, I've been covering Ukraine and its politics and its protests for almost a decade now, since the so-called Orange Revolution, and never in my life I've expected that I will be breathing pepper and tear gas in the heart of Kiev. And this was the case. No one expected such brutal violence from both sides, from both the police and the protesters, to happen. On Friday, 10 days ago, most of us journalists went home after a big rally, expecting it to be just another protest during the night. Then the police came at 5 o'clock in the morning and dispersed the crowd very brutally. 36 hours later, I was walking down the Krishchatek Street towards the Independence Square with a crowd of absolutely raging, aggressive people. They were really charged with what happened 2 days before that. And later, we saw what happened at the presidential office building, something completely unexpected for Ukraine, I should say.
But we did see scenes of protesters looking fairly organised in the way they were protesting, didn't we?
Oh, yes, indeed. Especially the takeover of the City Hall building. I couldn't witness it with my own eyes. I was at a different place at that time. But later I saw the footage. They looked like a very well-prepared army, because the way they were storming the building, this looks like a Hollywood movie. They knew what they were doing exactly. And it's really hard to say. It's more of a conspiracy theory. Who stands behind it? Who was responsible for preparing these men? But definitely they were prepared, and this is something new for Ukraine, and I can say that based on my past experience.
Okay, well, let's talk to Srdja Trifkovic. He's joining us live here. Srdja, downtown Kiev at the moment is dotted with tents and barricades. We understand the security forces could well be moving in now, but the way that we've seen this demonstration carried out over the last couple of weeks, is it the sort of thing we'd have seen in other countries, the US and indeed in Europe? Wouldn't these protesters have been dispersed well before now?
Oh, of course. I was in the United States 9 weeks ago when a mentally deranged African-American woman from Massachusetts was killed by Capitol Police because she didn't stop as instructed. It turned out that she was unarmed and that she even had her child on the back seat. What is sauce for the goose in Brussels and Washington, however, is not sauce for the Ukrainian gander, because all along it's not the welfare of the Ukrainian people or the interest of the Ukrainian state that the Western elite are interested in. They're looking upon Ukraine as a pawn in a zero-sum game called Russia's loss is our benefit. And the whole issue really boils down to a geopolitical struggle for what, in Harold Mackinders' terms, could be called the European heartland. Ukraine is, in geopolitical terms, indeed, the most important country in Europe. And the funny thing is, and I know Ukraine fairly well, I was there as an observer for the Verkhovna Rada election a year ago, that it will neither be wholly European in the Brussels sense, nor will it ever be wholly pro-Russian, because it is fundamentally divided.
All right, okay, well, let's just hear now from the European point of view. Marusya, welcome to our discussion here on RT International. What do you make of what Srdja's just said?
Thank you very much for invitation to take participation in this discussion. I think that Ukraine is really a very big country and European country, and it is in the big role in the European policy as a whole. But I think that as a European country, it will be a very good partners for the European Union. So European Union needs Ukraine, and Ukraine needs European Union.
Okay, well, thank you very much thank you. Let me just quickly ask Aleksey about this. That's what people are protesting about. They know exactly what they want, don't they? And they echo the sentiments of what we just heard there from Marusya.
I would disagree with that because essentially there's been a lot of misconception about the nature of this protest. Everyone, most of the media reported that this is the pro-EU protest in Kiev. And I spent several nights on Maidan, on the Independence Square, talking to the people. There was a huge part of crowd who were just spreading these bands, Ukrainian flag, and saying, "We European here." Those people, I talked with them. What they were saying is, we want to live in a country where law is respected, where law is observed, where laws are proper and fine. We don't want this corruption. And we understand, they told me, that we'll not be part of the European Union anytime soon, probably in the next 50 years. But there was another part of the crowd which carried party slogans, party banners. Some part of this crowd was, as we call them in Ukraine, flag wavers. They paid for small chunk, but still it was there. And there was a totally different crowd. Right. They were brainwashed in many ways.
All right, but brainwashed, Marusya, but even some economists are pouring cold water on the aspirations of those people who want integration. They say that Ukraine's association with the EU will mean nothing short of a nuclear energy shutdown, agricultural collapse, the virtual destruction of Ukraine's car and military industry, and what's more important, Ukraine will have nowhere to export its products. Marusya, you are there in the heart of Europe. Do you really believe that that could be the case?
Yes, I think that European Union is based on values, and European citizens as well, Ukrainian citizens need these values. So I think that collaboration and cooperation between the European Union and Ukraine will support the Ukrainian citizens to achieve many results in their prosperity. So it's a very good idea to have a collaboration and to sign the association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine.
So prosperity, let me just ask Robert Oulds here. He's in London from the Bruges think tank. Just make that clear, Robert, where your stance is. You're indeed anti-European, but prosperity for the Ukrainians, that is what the EU membership will offer in the long term.
Yes, I think that
the Bruges group is pro-European. We're pro-democracy. We are in favour of the nation states and against the European Union, which is anti-democratic. European Union values are ones where the rule of the elite takes precedence over those of democratically elected officials. The European Union is about institutionalised corruption based in Brussels and excessive regulation. If the Ukraine signs a partnership agreement with the EU, it will have to enforce EU regulations with very little input into those laws. That will be very damaging for the Ukrainian economy. It will mean job losses. The people who are protesting at the moment should realise that an association agreement with the European Union could well mean that they will be out of a job. They should recognise that. Really,
well, let me just
customs
ask Marusya
union
here.
with
She
Russia
should
would
know
actually
about,
make far more sense.
Thank you, Robert. Marusya will know about EU membership. Bulgaria, of course, is an EU member. How's it been working for your country? Tell us the benefits.
Yes, of course. We pass many difficulties in our way to the European Union. So I have my efforts, and my country has also its own efforts for this. And I think that the human rights and the economic cooperation and all the values, freedom of movement, freedom of speaking, freedom of knowledge, will help the Ukrainian citizens to be more free and to be more successful. So it's very important to know that the European Union, based on the values, is not only economic issue, it's not only economic union. It's a union of values, and it's a union of cooperation. It's not just the money which should give to the European citizens, but it's much more.
Okay.
More for more. And it's very important to understand, and very important to have a very big dialogue with the European, between the European citizens and Ukrainian citizens, including, of course, the government.
All right, Robert, just a quick comment from you, and then we'll bring in Ivor Crotty.
Of the European Union haven't been signed off in nearly 20 years because they're riddled with waste, fraud and corruption. The European Union is causing enormous damage to countries, particularly in the south. The European Union is about mass unemployment. That's what we're seeing emerging across the whole of the European Union. Really, and if Ukraine signs a deal with the EU, it will mean people will be out of jobs. That's the effect. It doesn't make economic sense.
Robert, thank you very much.
Instead of
Let me quickly ask Ivor, that's exactly not what the politicians were saying to the protesters in Kiev's central square over the last few days. Politicians from not just Ukraine, but elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Aleksey's point earlier about the flag wavers, I think springs to mind here. I think what we're seeing is just a lot of flag waving around very bipolar ideals. I think Srdja's point about Ukraine being offered a zero-sum solution being the problem is absolutely bang on. I think people have to realise that Ukraine's historical position is to look both east and west, is to buffer the Western European peninsula with the Eurasian heartland, and that its historical position has to be respected as such. To have politicians arriving in Maidan Square from Poland, particularly from Poland, but we also, the German Foreign Minister Westerwelle and the Dutch Foreign Minister Timmermans was also on Maidan. And to have these people troop the colour, as it were, and to support these protests, even after the government survived a no-confidence motion in the Verkhovna Rada, I find quite extraordinary. We were having a bit of fun with this on Twitter today, and I can only compare it to if Sergei Lavrov turned up in Glasgow and called on London to hear the voices of freedom in Scotland, and then aligned himself with a group of supporters who were trained by Glasgow Celtic or Glasgow Rangers. You know, it's just an extraordinarily divisive form of politics. But it cuts right across both Maidan and the digital media sphere as well. If you look at the US ambassador's Twitter feed, and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Geoffrey Pratt, his Twitter feed reads like something from the Orange Revolution in 2004. The British ambassador, Simon Smith, didn't have a Twitter account until November 25th, and then coincidentally suddenly got one just as the iron was hot.
Okay, just a very brief comment from Srdja there, because we haven't heard from you for a couple of minutes. Srdja, you just heard what Ivor said. Just very briefly, a response to that.
In the long term, however, I don't think we'll see the Orange Revolution redux, because I think that there is a substantial percentage of Ukrainian citizens who realize that neither in economic terms nor in terms of so-called values is there anything to be gained from the association with the EU. Back in 2004, nobody wanted to risk anything for the discredited Kuchma establishment. Nowadays, I think that many people, particularly in the south and in the east, knows that their livelihood depends on developing connections with the only power that can offer some relief now, immediately. And by the way, I'm amazed that a Bulgarian politician can talk in glowing terms about the European Union when Bulgaria is now the basket case, importing tomatoes from Turkey, for goodness sake. And Bulgaria used to supply all of Eastern and Central Europe with vegetables only 20 years ago.
Okay, Srdja, just a very quick comment, because I want to conclude this now. Where's this going to lead to? Because after all, as it's been coming very clear now, these protesters, they don't just want EU association, they want to get rid of the government, the parliament, the cabinet, the president. Is that going to happen? Will the government survive? Just briefly.
I believe that Yanukovych has weathered the storm, and there will be no repetition of November of 2004.
And Robert Oulds, where do you think this is leading to?
Ukraine will join with the European Union in any kind of association agreement. It doesn't make economic sense. The Bruges Group had recognised that several years ago when we studied the EU's Eastern Neighbourhood Partnership, customs union with its largest trading partners, which are Russia and the other CIS states, make far more sense than any deal with the European Union.
OK, Marusya, from what we've heard then, it doesn't look like Ukraine will ever join the European Union.
I'd like to say that Bulgaria has its 7 successful years in the European Union. So we have our good results, economic, in the education, in the social spheres, so in the unemployment, of course, to solve the problems with the unemployment. So I don't agree with the comments that we are not successful and our integration to
because
the
you're on the payroll of the European Union.
OK, all right, let's leave it there. We really have run out of time. Marusya Lyubcheva, Bulgarian MEP, historian Srdja Trifkovic, international affairs expert Robert Oulds, and also Ivor Crotty and Aleksey Yaroshevsky live here on RT International. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion.